The stock market had a huge crash. And by the way, the Biden administration has continued to tell people that the economy is great. I've been debunking that for the past 3 years, especially this year. And here we go, right? Because I want to start with this clip here from CNN. And then I'm going to explain to you how the unemployment rate has something to do with the stock market crash. This is affecting the entire world right now. Let's go ahead and get into this clip here.
But as we look to Wall Street and see the Dow going down as part of this global market panic, let's begin there. And let's bring in CNN's Julia Chatterley. Julia, we hear the bell there. What's the damage?
It was an ugly day. Just to give you some context here, this is the worst trading day for stock markets in nearly 2 years. In the early minutes of the session today, we saw around $1 trillion worth of wealth wiped off just a handful of the biggest tech stocks. So ugly is the way to describe it. I won't use the word panic. This is not panic, let's be clear. But there is a palpable concern out there that the US economy is slowing far quicker than we thought. And that was fueled by, as you said, the jobs number that we got on Friday. Weaker manufacturing.
Pause. Okay. Let me just go ahead and push back on something that she said here, because she said there's no need to panic. They say this every time, right? Even when they say like, no, we're not headed towards a recession, there's no need to panic. They say this every time. But she's bringing up that jobs number report. Now, that is a pushback on Joe Biden's talking points, because he continued to tell you that the job report is great. We created all these jobs. Isn't that what he said? We created all these jobs. And I told you, they never tell you what those jobs are. They don't even tell you the sector, right? So I don't expect them to stand there and say and name each position that was created, but they can at least tell you we created a number of jobs in the tech industry or the auto services industry or something like that. They don't even do that. They just said we created all these jobs. A lot of those jobs I told you before are temp jobs, contract positions. Those are not permanent positions. And a lot of times they don't have full-time benefits, right? So just keep that in mind. But again, another example to show you they were not telling you the truth about the jobs. Let's continue.
Manufacturing data last week as well. It's raised questions about why on earth the Fed didn't cut rates last week if it knew this data was coming. And I think there's justifiable concern there. I also think we have to take a step back briefly and just say, look, we're still overall adding jobs to the US economy. No one's talking about imminent recession, but they are talking about rising risks and that the Fed should act on that. And I think they will. Now, if it were just that, I'd be tempted to suggest that there's an overreaction going on in stock markets, but the problem is it's not just that. One of the strongest pillars of the market so far this year has been the tech stocks. And we've now, for a number of days, seen a lot of people taking money off the table. They're still in profit, but they're just taking money off the table, and that's had an impact. Fast forward to what we saw last night. The Japanese stock market, that fell 12%. Now that is panic. And you don't see something like that without seeing pressure on US markets. Plus it's summertime. There's simply less investors out there. Jake, I will say there's silver linings. The conversation has changed now over the Fed. It's not about if they cut rates in September. It's about how much they do. And I think that's the right conversation to be having.
Everybody hearing this? It's not about if, it's how much they cut in September. So you see, now we are going into November presidential election. And this is why I've continued to say, if you really are running against, whether you're third party, independent, et cetera, if you are running against the Biden administration, instead of focusing on, there's a lot of people focusing on whether or not Kamala Harris is black or whatever, yada, yada, right? That is a trick by the Democratic Party that I do think Donald Trump and the Republicans fell for. That's a trick. I said, for one, focus on her record, focus on her policies or lack thereof. There's still today. I've been checking every day. There is no policy platform on her website. The focus should be more so on the economy. That is the number one issue for voters, is the economy. But I don't hear anybody talking about this. And now we have a stock market crash. It was just a month or so ago that I told you there were financial reports that revealed that we were in 2008 numbers numbers that we had during the housing crisis. I told you back then that Joe Biden was lying about the economy. The first time I told you that was in March when that report was released. And the reality is, like, I have the time to look up that information, but the average American does not have the time to look up that information. So if you are only consuming corporate media and the president is telling you that the job numbers are great and the economy is great, you're more likely to believe it if you're not really paying attention to the economic conditions around you, especially if you have the money, right? But here we are. Let's continue.
All right, Julia Chatterley, thanks so much for that. I appreciate it. Let's discuss further with CNN Global economic analyst Rana Foroohar. Rana, so you think that this big correction in the market is not just about the jobs numbers, the disappointing unemployment number from last week. What else do you think might be at play here?
Well, the question is, what isn't at play? I mean, Julia is absolutely right that tech is a big part of this story. I said back in March that I thought that AI in particular, which is the story that's been driving the gains in a lot of those tech stocks, may have been overblown. That's not to say it's not going to pay off, but it's not going to pay off tomorrow. It's not going to pay off next quarter. This is a 10-year story. And I think the markets are starting to recognize that, particularly as earnings come in, and there have been some disappointing numbers in recent days. We also have an incredibly precarious geopolitical situation out there right now. And with Kamala Harris making gains now in the presidential race and looking stronger, I think a lot of investors that may have been thinking, oh, I'm going to get a Trump 2 administration, maybe there's going to be tax cuts for corporates, they're maybe rethinking that. So there's just a lot in play. And of course, there is also some data, and this is important to suggest that there is a slowdown in the U.S. economy. Let me say, I'm not overly worried about that. I mean,
Pause. Did you hear what she just said? There is a slowdown in the American economy, which is what I have been saying. The Biden administration has been lying to you about the economy. Now, then she goes on to say, I'm not really worried about that. You should be. You should be. When prices are high and there's a slowdown in the economy, you should be concerned about that.
We have frankly been due, I think, for a bit of a slowdown. We've had an incredibly robust recovery, but I would want to see another one or two data points to support that before I would say, yes, this is a big deal. This is a recession.
So some economic analysts point out that the market is not the same thing as the economy. They're related,
sure,
but it's not the same thing. And they're arguing that investors are overreacting right now. You agree with that?
I do totally agree with that. And I would also say there's an entire generation, multiple generations actually, of investors that have never been in the market in a period of rising interest rates. So, they look at, over 4% interest rates and say, oh my gosh, the sky's falling, and we need to lower them again. Well, let's take it one step at a time. This Fed has been very focused on Main Street, very focused on making sure that inflation doesn't hit working people in their pocketbooks. And I think that is where the emphasis should be. Investors have made a lot of money in recent years. We're talking not about losses right now. We're talking about gains being given back. And I would note that aside from tech stocks and, some of the other sectors, there were, even at the end of this trading day, some gains in areas like industrials, real estate. So the sky is not falling yet. And I'm not too worried about Wall Street becoming poor.
So
real estate where people have money, right? So a lot of people that are in real estate, they have money. She mentioned that we should be concerned about the inflation not hitting, working people's pockets, but it's been hitting our pockets. People have been dealing with this for, I'd say, didn't we start talking about inflation like 2 years ago? So right after the war with Russia and Ukraine started. So the thing is like, that has been happening. So this is CNN trying to, again, they do this every time there's a possibility we're entering a recession. They never want to say the R word because they know it scares people and people freak out. But the reality is the stock market crashing is a big deal. Again, like I said, these numbers, these are record-breaking numbers. Look at this. I want to show you what they said here in Vox because I want to talk about the unemployment factor with the stock market. What caused the global stock market meltdown? Stock plunged across the world Monday. Does it mean the U.S. recession is looming? See, told you they don't really like to say the R word on corporate media too much. But listen to this. The Dow fell more than 1,000 points, while the S&P 500 and NASDAQ were both down more than 3%, marking the S&P 550's biggest one-day drop since September 2022. Now that's going back to, we were still kind of dealing with remnants of the pandemic during that time. So the biggest drop since 2022. The slides came after Japan's Nikkei index had its worst day since its Black Monday crash of 1987, dropping 12.4%, and as European markets struggled as well. Now listen to this. The heavy losses signal that investors are rattled following reports last week showing that the U.S. had only added 114,000 jobs in July, below expectations of about 150,000, and that unemployment had risen 4.3%. We're going to highlight unemployment had risen 4.3%, because what have I told you about the jobs? We created all these jobs. We created 200,000 jobs. But the unemployment rate rose to 4.3%. They have not been honest with you about the layoffs. I'm telling you who's laying people off. Independent media has been telling you who's laying people off. The Biden administration has not been honest with you about that. Anytime I'm seeing even tech companies, pharma companies, anytime I'm seeing all of these companies that have a lot of money laying off 600 workers, 300 workers, 400 workers, back to back to back to back, that signals that there is a problem. And they didn't want you to know about it. They have not been honest with you. And that's why they didn't tell you about it, because they didn't want people to freak out. They've been lying about the job numbers. They've been lying about unemployment. And then the stock market crashed. And that's the only reason some people are hearing about it now. It goes on to say this is higher than any month since October 2021. Again, that's during the pandemic. So we are seeing we are seeing unemployment numbers greater now than during the pandemic. Everybody needs to pay attention to this. I'm sorry, but this is just the reality. There's no pandemic right now. So what's the excuse now? These numbers are not in and of themselves a crisis. The unemployment rate is still relatively low, and the underperformance in hiring isn't catastrophic. But both have been taken as signals that the U.S. economy might be showing some cracks. You think? Even though many economists projected that the U.S. would avoid a recession after the pandemic-induced economic slump, and despite the fact that it has done so, the reports reignited concerns that a U.S. recession could still happen, wreaking disastrous potential impacts across the global economy. On Monday, Goldman Sachs raised its odds of a recession occurring in the next year from 15% to 25%. It is impossible to say now how realistic those recession fears are, but it may be too early for a panic. The U.S. economy wasn't just supposed to be good. It actually is in pretty good shape. Well, we'll hear about that. Let's go to what Professor Richard Wolff has to say, because he has tried to warn people that this was coming. And this also shows you a big issue with capitalism, because this is what I've said time and time again. When people say, let's just put guardrails on capitalism, how do you even go about doing that? Right? You cannot have capitalism without some type of exploitation in place. Now, Richard Wolff, for the longest time, has continued to tell people that you need to move towards worker co-ops. I'm all support for unions. I support unions, but I've always told you that should just be the beginning. That is not the end game. And the reason is because these companies that you could decide to create a union at, these companies can outsource when they want to. We have also seen where unions, the management in these unions have turned on the workers. They've turned against the rank and file members. And if you don't own a piece of the company, which in a union you do not, in a worker cooperative you do, you are still at the behest of the CEO of that company. Richard Wolff breaks this down so great. Let's bring this in.
We left off, as I explained, that governments borrow because it's the politicians' cheap way out. That is, the politicians can give us no increase in taxes. You notice how they stumble over each other, promising that. Meanwhile, giving corporations what they want and giving the public as much as they can what they want. Why do they do that? Well, clearly, from the public, they need votes. And beyond a certain point, you can't tax people without them coming back and not voting for you. They've all learned that lesson. Corporations, it's a little different. If you tax them, they won't give you money, donations, pay for the lobbyists to do your job, give your party the money it needs for expensive TV ads, thereby jeopardizing your election. So the corporations know you're going to take care of them by not taxing them.
Yep.
And the corporations repay your kindness. They give you the big donations, the big contributions. And what do the politicians use them for? To not explain, or rather to explain falsely what's going on here. To hide from most of you what is in fact going on. Here is the key point. Corporations get out of paying their fair share, just like rich people do. All tax studies show you that. Take a look. I've done it on this program countless times. You should know. Corporations get out of paying taxes. Many of the biggest corporations pay no taxes year after year. The tax code is written to enable them to do that.
Such as Amazon and Netflix. Remember, they didn't pay taxes. I mean, they're able to just get away with this, right?
The same is with rich people. The most important single economic act of Donald Trump's 4 years in office was the tax cut of December 2017, which was an enormous gift to corporations and the rich. And that's the normal behavior. And Mr. Biden didn't undo that. Basically left it in place.
Yep.
Okay, so the corporations get a tax break and the rich do. And in return, they fund the politicians who do that.
Does everybody see the connection? But the workers don't get this tax break, right? Like, we're not getting this type of tax break. And I'm so glad that he mentioned that Joe Biden decided to keep some of those tax breaks in place with the corporations, because this is the number thing that people leave out when people talk about, well, Trump gave these tax breaks to corporations, but they'll leave out that Biden also continued those tax breaks. So they're both for the Wall Street class.
And they give those politicians enough money so that they can run glitzy ads and hire lots of public relations people to make sure you don't understand what deficits and national debt actually mean. So here we go. When the government borrows, who do you think it borrows from? Has a government agent recently visited your home and asked you to lend to the government? Of course not.
That would be funny if they did. Knock on my door if you want to.
You have no idea about that because that doesn't happen to you. But if you're a big bank and you're a big corporation, you deal with the government and buy bonds, i.e. lend them money all the time. It's a normal part of big corporation activity. It's even a normal part of rich people's portfolio at their stockbroker, buying and selling government bonds. So here's the point. The corporations don't have to pay taxes, and the rich don't have to pay taxes because the politicians arrange it for them. Yeah. Then, of course, the government doesn't have those taxes. So what does the government do? Borrow, because it's not raising taxes from corporations and the rich. But from whom does it borrow? Here we go. Corporations and the rich. They're the major lenders to the government. What they lend to the government is what the government did not tax from them. If the government had taxed that money from them, the government wouldn't need to borrow. And if the government didn't need to borrow, we wouldn't have deficits and we wouldn't have a national debt.
Did everybody take that in? If the government did not need to borrow, we would not have a deficit and we would not have a national debt. What that means is the rich need to be taxed and pay their fair share. These corporations need to be taxed and pay their fair share. And we would not end up in this situation. We're paying the taxes. And rich people are just like, yeah, what they're giving them all types of breaks. It doesn't make any sense. If someone makes $1 million a year, or let's go a little bit more extreme. If someone makes like $200 million a year and you make $35,000 a year, why are you paying taxes, but they're not? It does not make any sense. So ultimately, what has happened here is that the burden of taxes has been shifted to the working class. That is what they have done. And more people should be livid about this. We didn't talk about starting a movement. Maybe they need to be moving over this. Because again, why is it that the working class people have to pay taxes, but rich people don't have to pay what they're supposed to pay? I can't believe there aren't enough people angry about that.
So when you hear about deficits and debt, here's the key point. It's a sign that politicians have caved in to corporations and the rich. And we know how they do it. First of all, the tax laws are written to favor them. Then there are trillions, we've done the research, of assets held by corporations and the rich in places called, get it, tax havens. You know why they're called tax havens? And they include places like Caribbean islands or the state of North Dakota or all kinds. Or maybe it's South Dakota, one of them.
Those offshore accounts, right? So they have offshore accounts, more money in those accounts. And again, because it's an offshore account, it's just kind of like somewhat hidden.
There are all kinds of tax havens where you can go and hide your money and not pay taxes. That's the game, friends.
Yep.
The government says to corporations and the rich, you don't have to pay. Instead, you can lend the money to us. And of course, for corporations and the rich, this is a no-brainer. Rather than have your money taken as a tax, like we all do in our weekly check, instead of being taxed, you give that same amount of money to the government, same government, but it's a loan, and the government pays it back plus interest.
Plus interest. And here's something that we all need to think about. While we are angry with our working class neighbor, as I've said time and time again, rich people, and in particular, the billionaire class, they get away with murder in this country. They really do. Elon Musk, I know more people are more mad at him now than they were before when he first decided to purchase Twitter. A lot of people thought that he was going to be this free speech like advocate or whatever, but people are more mad at him now because they see that's not the case. But for people who jumped on the Elon Musk bandwagon and they were just like, oh, this guy's gonna be great. He's one of the good ones. Nah, he ain't paying no taxes either. These people are literally just getting away with it. So this is part of the exploitation, ladies and gentlemen, because if the billionaires were to pay what they're supposed to pay in taxes, this could end some of that exploitation. This should not even be allowed. But it is, because The billionaires own the corporations own the politicians, Wall Street owns the politicians. And so the politicians, instead of them doing for us and fighting for the working class, they fight for the billionaire class because all of these people are linked together. That's why they don't do anything for the workers. That's why. They'll give you a little bit of crumbs. Like you'll be able to have like a union. Yeah, let's just help them start a union. Yay, pro-worker, woo. But this is why we don't have a living wage in this country. This is why they haven't increased the minimum wage in this country, is because of all these things. All these people are connected together. So I always say, if you really want to make a big change in electoral politics, you have to remove corporate money from electoral politics. It's all connected.
And where will the government get the money to pay back the lenders plus interest? Well, from you and me, because we can't play that game. We don't have the money to lend the government. It is a scam and a ripoff, and it always has been. It is one of the greatest gifts modern capitalist governments give to their corporations and the rich. And if you haven't understood it, you now understand why you haven't understood it, why it hasn't been made clear. Don't get lost in the details. That's the core reality.
Everybody, let's remember what Professor Wolff said, because it is a scam. So every time you hear politicians complain about the deficit, the national debt, even right now, when you hear them complain about the stock market crash, etc., I want you to tie it all back to the billionaire class. And a lot of people don't want to do that because they depend on that billionaire class in some way, shape, or form. A lot of the politicians do. That's just a reality. Yeah, I like that, Brian. Unbillionaire the billionaires. Yeah. This is one thing I will say Bernie was right about when he said we have to get rid of. Now, do you see why people were saying get rid of the billionaires? Because they're not paying their fair share. They're not paying their fair share. They're exploiting the workers. They're making all this money and they're not even paying what they're supposed to pay for taxes because we're paying it.